Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining in for our second episode of Sustainability, the New Normal. And this is Vamsi Krishna. I'm your host, and I'm a consultant at eValueServe working in the field of sustainability with organizations across the world and helping businesses go forward in this transition to a better world. Today, I'm joined by my guest, Marine Cornelis. Marine, please, the floor is yours. Would love to introduce yourself.
Thank you so much, Vamsi, and thank you so much for having me with you today. So my name is Marine Cornelis. I'm also a consultant, but I'm based in Europe, and I work on EU policies and actually international policies that focus on delivering for the people, on the social and human dimensions of the energy and climate transition. And I'm not only a consultant working on policy, I'm also a communicator. This is my second hat. So I try to make sure let's say, the project and the examples that we are building throughout the world get communicated in a way that everybody can grasp, because I believe that the energy transition is really an opportunity for everyone to improve their quality of life, to improve their comfort, to improve their well-being. And this cannot happen without good communication as well.
Definitely. Thank you so much. Thank you for that introduction. So, European energy landscape, right? So, for many of us, the way we look at it, right, we would think that the EU and the wider Europe in general, right, being relatively much far well developed, would definitely be ahead of the curve when it comes to the energy transition, right? And which is also a part of where your work is largely focused on. And we would think that the EU's energy transition, as well as its journey, is relatively far ahead compared to its peers around the world. But that may not be the case, as we understand now, with the results coming out of the European, especially what's going on in the Eastern Europe in the given the crisis for energy. How would you look at the, let's say, from the EU clean energy policy perspective, right? How would you look at the best and the worst, of the EU energy policies that have shaped the EU landscape? Maybe if you would like to focus more on the social and the human aspects to help us understand.
Yeah, so I think Europe is a really interesting case, because Europe is, let's say, traditionally kind of responsible for global warming, since it's like one of the oldest industrialized and continent that had also like a massive use of resources coming from abroad. So there is this, let's say, traditional responsibility over climate change, and some kind of responsibility that they have to do, that Europe and Europeans have to do something. But at the same time, you have very, very different realities in Western Europe and in Eastern Europe as well. And this is because of levels of industrialization. It's also because of, let's say, the traditional economic fabric in this evolution, let's say, of those two parts of the European continent. And now it's acting with one voice at, let's say, the climate negotiation level as the European Union. But they are very strong. There are still many, many differences between, let's say, the Atlantic and the ocean, and what's coming far in the Mediterranean, for instance. So that's also why it's interesting. So beyond that, the European Union has decided to kind of try to lead the way, because the EU is taking ownership of this responsibility, to showcase that it's possible to, let's say, economic growth and prosperity of its population with the CO2 emissions and the greenhouse gas emissions as well. And last year, for instance, we managed to get to the lowest level of CO2 emissions and greenhouse gas emissions since the 1960s. It's amazing. I mean, we managed to go such a far length, but it has required a lot of investment and a lot of, let's say, commitment to make sure that this happens, and it doesn't happen in a vacuum, because every EU policy is now kind of oriented towards getting to climate neutrality. It's a strong commitment. It's what's called like the EU Green Deal, to really go into that kind of green transition and to show the way, to be the leader in this endeavor. And it is like, of course, it's like an intention that comes from policymakers, stimulated by the Paris Agreement and so on. But it's also something that was tremendously boosted by the COVID crisis and by the Russian attack on Ukraine, because Europe needed like overnight almost to wean itself from fossil fuels coming from Russia. And that has really boosted the adoption of green regulations and clean energy regulations as well.
Right, definitely. And in fact, do you think that this movement towards maybe more fossil-based energies due to the crisis in Russia and Ukraine. Do you think that has hurt EU's green credentials a bit? And also, do you think that has affected the parity, energy parity at the European, for the green transition of Europe?
Yeah, no, what has proven kind of wrong is that that actually clean energy is much cheaper than fossil fuel energy, and that is like a strong lesson, like for the whole world, that you can actually do better with less harm on the environment with clean energy. The thing is, at the same time as the beginning of the war, we also had this gas price crisis, like a kind of war on gas prices. And the EU price setting mechanism for electricity and gas is totally coupled, which means that if the price of gas increases, the electricity price will increase as well. And of course, it creates a lot of distortion, which was also fed by some kind of inflation. And we are still, I mean, many of my EU citizens are still facing the cost of living crisis. There is still inflation. I won't say that it's far away, but at the same time, it has put the issue of addressing energy poverty, so addressing really the social impacts of the energy prices into much higher into the agenda. But let me tell you in 1 second what energy poverty is. It's about the inability for home to adequately or their home or really live with the optimal standards of living. So it comes mostly from three issues, which are actually high energy prices, but also high energy expenditure, like a lot of consumption coming from your home, and poor energy efficiency of your home, which means that you have like three factors to jump into, and one of them is of course the energy price. And let's say that many regulations and policymakers are now working on making sure the price is actually fairer for households, but there is also a strong like movement to make sure that our home, the place where we spend the most time in, are actually much more resilient, much more future-proof, and consume way less energy by nature. Really, so it's what has been recently approved as the Energy Performance of Building Directive, EPBD.
Okay, so you would say that the countries are now also realizing that moving towards the path towards the transition is also going to help them bring down their bills and also going to help fight energy poverty in Europe.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And it's not only a question of poverty, it's a question of resilience towards climate change, because Europe, it was also released a couple of weeks ago. Europe is potentially the continent that is potentially the most likely to be affected by climate change, and it is the most vulnerable to climate change, really. This is totally clear, except that in Europe, it's quite a rich continent. We have insurance, we have a lot of things, we have strong governments that are actually able to compensate for at least part of the damages that are produced by climate change. So maybe we don't really realize it. But let me tell you an example. In Spain, in Barcelona, in the region of Barcelona, which is one of the, let's say, the most touristic places in Europe, this region has been facing an insane drought for a couple of years now, and they don't have water. So what do you do when you don't have water? Because everything is linked, of course, in the energy and climate transition. So what do you do when you have water? You have like the first impacts and the first effects of climate change. So it's not only about the ability to pay, but about the ability to make sure that when now European when money is invested in Europe, it is in a way that is okay for today, it's okay for tomorrow. Well, in a nutshell, that is sustainable. It's what sustainable means.
So would you say that the European Green Deal was not able to foresee this? Or I'm sure perhaps it definitely looked at scenarios where such a case would have been possible or may not be. Do you think that was a kind of a lack of foresight that has brought to the current situation now? Or like, how would you look at it as like one of the challenges, right, going further in policy making? How would these issues be handled better?
There are many ways and the way those issues could be handled better. But let me tell you by a fact. Europe and European policymakers, whatever their like political orientation, nobody denies climate science. What they
Right.
may deny, or what it's like the ambitions, and certain people, very populistic, let's say parties or individuals, they will try to water down certain policies by saying, yeah, the impact on the population is going to be too high, it's going to increase poverty, so let's not do this or that. Except they are wrong, because to keep on being one of the leaders in sustainability, one of the leading economies in the world, knowing also that we have an aging population, we need to keep on investing. And now, what makes economic sense, what makes social sense, really, what is almost the only way forward. I mean, there are plenty of nuances, of course, in the way you do things, but it's sustainability that makes sense. It's sustainability because it reconciles really the environmental and social aspects together. Of course, you need to have safeguards. That's really one of the things I've been kind of advocating for in many different projects that I've been accompanying, that you need safeguards. If you, for instance, decide to go for a full renovation of let's say, a city center, to reduce energy cost, reduce energy poverty, and so on, you also need to have safeguards so that the people who were already living in those homes can keep on living in those homes, that they are not like brought to the outskirts because they are no longer able to pay. So, I mean, sustainability, if done properly, really improves the quality of life of everyone. But you need to have like strong incentives. You need to have a strong message from policymakers, from local governance as well, to say, okay, we want it to be done in a way that is fair and inclusive of people, whatever their circumstances. And that's exactly what is behind the idea of the just transition in
Exactly.
Europe.
So also to be able to wean off, let's say, the Russian gas, right, while able to build capacity internally, and also, for example, right, we're talking about a lot of manufacturing being done outside of Europe, right, for example. So there should also be a kind of creating a dependency for raw materials, right, and supply chains outside Europe, which probably has to be addressed, which is also kind of causing a big bottleneck, I would say, for a lot of renewable energy supply chains. In fact, which are driving the project prices of the projects of solar and wind higher, because there is no internal that mechanism to have its own capacity, that the external dependency is going up. So how would you also see in the making the coming policies fit for a digital age? Right, there are, I'm sure there are lots of ways to make things happen, and now we have AI to improve the accountability as well. So how do you see this playing fit in the digital age?
So recently, the EU has also taken some very bold steps towards kind of regulating the digital area, and somehow it has like been discussing an act on artificial intelligence to make sure that the artificial intelligence we find in Europe is actually like fair, it is actually ethical. So we could talk about this for hours, but it's a topic that is absolutely fascinating, because it's like one of the first regulations of its kind, that to really have digital tools that actually serve people and kind of should be doing no harm by design. And it's some measures that are, of course, that are supposed to be like, that will be implemented everywhere in the European continent. But one of the forces of Europe, it's its ability to kind of set norms for the rest of the world. So many countries will also follow this example too, which I find super positive, because I think that AI tools are really interesting and really exciting, but at the same time they need to be fair by design. It means that they need to respect the human beings that are behind, and instead of being tools that could be used by, let's say, malicious agents, whoever they are. And what is also interesting with this AI Act is that it aims to have like a two-tier framework, meaning that the biggest actors will have to comply very strictly to certain rules, whereas smaller actors and startups, especially the ones that are funded by public money from governments, etc., they will be able to experiment a little bit more. And that's also kind of good for competition and for stimulating, let's say, a framework that is also encouraging for smaller businesses and new forms of AI as well.
So actually, I have an interesting question when you mentioned that, that's something where Europe is doing amazingly well. I was looking at, if you could share a few examples, right, where maybe Europe can learn from around the world, as well as Europe can give back to the world in terms of its journey of its energy transition there.
Yeah, so I mean, there are a lot of things to learn from Europe, of course, but there are many things to learn from the rest of the world. And really, in my own career, I've tried not to look only at Europe, but also at the rest of the world. I've worked in Africa and Latin America as well. Never in Asia and never in India. I hope that we will be able to correct that course one day or another. But I would, I mean, there are a few examples that come to my mind. The first is actually about the electricity, the way it's produced in Europe. It tends to be very, very centralized because of like the legacy of a centralized system with, let's say, big power plants that power a lot of cities, a lot of households, a lot of businesses around the country. Whereas there are really interesting things happening in different parts of the world, such as Colombia in Medellin or in Madagascar, with some models known as mini grids, where basically you have like a more decentralized energy production. Why does that matter? It's because basically when you don't have to transport electricity from one big power plant to, let's say, a neighborhood or a village or whatever, you make a lot of economies somehow. You spend less money on the infrastructures, on maintaining those big fat infrastructures that are actually not, that can be very, let's say, hard to maintain. But at the same time, you make sure that the electricity produced locally matches also the needs, the local needs. And so that makes a lot of, let's say, local economies of scale, if you want. And the potential of that is also the one that it can be owned by the people who are actually behind who are in those areas, which means that it's people-centered, really people-centered energy production that is tailored to the needs of the community. And I think it has a tremendous potential. It's named, I mean, the name of that is usually like the 4Ds of the energy transition, the decarbonization, I mean, through solar energy production, for instance, decentralization, just as I explained to you. Yeah, no, digitalization first, because you need digital tools to make sure that everything works smoothly. And then there is the fourth one, which is democratization, so closer to the needs. But actually, I've been like digging a little bit into this topic recently, and I found out that there is a fifth one, which would be really diversity, because it needs to take into account the diversity of the population, whether it is their, let's say, initial background, their like the social fabric, the local social fabric, but also, let's say, the personal circumstances of the people, whether they are rich or poor, or their sexual orientation, their level of ability, their racial differences, etc. And I think it's really beautiful that we can start thinking in energy not only as a product, but really as something that is closer to being a common, something that we can actually own together, that is closer to right than really something that only goes into a monetary and fiduciary transaction.
So it's interesting when you said that people should be owning that. So what exactly do you mean by that, and why do you think that it's relevant that people should be, owning it? So it is for the people, but why should it be owned by people, even though it is decentralized? Like, how can you expand a bit on that?
Yeah, sure. I mean, it's kind of important because it's closer to them and to their needs. And energy is one of those topics, one of those, let's say, essential services where we don't have any kind of oversight. It's, you may know the sausage analogy, like you don't know what's in a sausage. It's about the sausage maker. So you get into, you don't know what it is, you just have it on your table. And you are okay with that, you are not okay with that, you make your choice, but you are able to make it. Whether for the energy sector, it's not easy. Like it's even almost impossible to know what's in your own energy mix. So Europe has been like promoting ways for people to take ownership, to know if they can choose the green or gray electricity, things like that. There are a lot of certificates, there are a lot of measures, but let's say that this kind of citizen ownership is the next step in making sure that people have agency about their energy mix and about the way, let's say, the energy is produced. Because still to date, 75% of the greenhouse gas emissions, they come from the energy sector. And I mean, we shouldn't forget about that. If essentially the climate crisis is an energy crisis. So that's why it's so important to get into this kind of dimension. And the second point is that it's not like not everyone is able to put solar panels on their roof and be totally sufficient,
Right.
within their homes. And I mean, I live in Italy in an apartment building. Is it possible to install solar panels? Not for everyone. So you have to invent certain models to make sure that more people have agency and more people have the capacity to invest in the future they want to see.
Right. So that's actually brilliant that, yes, that to improve people's ownership, right? So that's where comes the citizen-led, energy transition, right? Where citizens feel that they're part of the infrastructure and they own it and they have the rights on it, right? Definitely. But there's one example that I think I came across in one of your podcast episodes, Marine. So which was regarding Costa Rica, recovering rainforests and easing into, carbon pricing. How far is that? Would you say that carbon credits, right? Would you say are truly making a difference in the transition?
Yeah, so carbon pricing is one of the clearest, let's say, signal that an investment is let's say correct to do or not, or sustainable to do and not. And it's also about paying the right prices for things. Let me make an analogy. When you go to a shop, in like a clothes shop in Europe, maybe you will find a €3 t-shirt and you say, oh great, I'm buying a €3 t-shirt, that's so cheap. But actually, when you pay €3 for your T-shirt, you don't pay the right cost for it, because it has been produced, it has been transported, it has been knitted. The cotton that made your shirt has been like cultivated somewhere. And do you really think that it costs €3? Not really. So actually, the carbon pricing is really, and you don't. I'm not even mentioning how, let's say, that maybe in 1 week or 2 weeks after wearing it twice you will have holes in your t-shirt and you will decide to dump it, because that's another conversation. And like the quantity of waste coming from the clothing sector is terrible. But you have to start paying for the right prices of things. It's really one of the key aspects of sustainability, right? To make sure that whenever you buy something, you do it in a way that is actually transparent, that you actually,
And fair.
yeah, and that you actually compensate the whole life cycle of this project. I mean, it's super interesting that you mentioned my podcast, because recently we've been talking about norms and international standards. We've also been talking about the textile sector and the kind of certifications and how sourcing can be different, can be complicated. But it's a whole ecosystem of things. And the EU, for instance, is now also discussing ways to avoid greenwashing, like having
Right.
clear sets of rules against greenwashing. That's super important. It's also one of the first of its
I
kind.
think that's a very fair point. The fair points that you mentioned, Mary. So, but that goes beyond carbon, right? Because it's not just carbon pricing. There is also social pricing involved. That we are not just paying. Okay, so yes, the t-shirt example, right? It's €3. That's very cheap. Now I'd love to buy 10 of those maybe. But then there is a lot of heavy carbon price attached to that. But apart from that, there is also a social price which is attached to it, that the people who worked on it were probably not paid fair enough. So
Yeah.
then there is carbon price, there is social price. So I believe that there is, at a wider level, there are several elements which are involved, which I think, more on the human elements, right, which are missing out. And especially in the context of energy transition, right? So we see that there is a lot of discussion that definitely goes around carbon, because yes, it is important. But this is also leading to, what is called as the carbon tunnel syndrome, where the rest of the other points are kind of, going into the shadow or being eclipsed by the size of the carbon challenge. Uh, could you talk a bit about your work that focuses more on these elements of the social and the human part?
Yeah, absolutely. Because I mean, whenever we talk about sustainability, it's kind of easy to fall into, let's say, a technocentric trap that will say,
Right.
okay, we keep on doing business as usual. We'll just have, let's say, techniques and new models and digital tools and really new things that will correct the course, basically. Whereas things are a little bit more complicated than that. There are some, I mentioned at the beginning, like the responsibility of Europe towards the rest of the world. But there is also a huge responsibility, for instance, in the fact that in Europe, we are gluttons of energy, of products, of everything, whereas let's say that sub-Saharan Africa is way behind on energy consumption, on product consumption, etc. So we are really almost living on two planets with the different boundaries, and there is this kind of dimension that we need to take into consideration. Because that is like making such a difference, like for all of us, really. So one of my jobs, one of my missions is really to say, okay, we are already not on the same level. We are the field is not level yet, and it's not because the field is not level that we have to widen the gap. It should be quite the contrary. My mission, and I work with clients who know that I have this vision, and they want to work for me because I've been working with different, really a very wide database of clients to help them really shift the focus to what it means for projects, for businesses to be really human centric. And it's not only about the adoption of a technology, making sure that it's designed in a way that is fair by essence and so on, but it's also that it's not forgetting anybody. And I mentioned diversity. I think it's really one of the aspects that we need to boost some. But there is one of the key aspects of diversity, acknowledging that women and men, they still have very different roles in societies, and somehow they will respond to challenges differently as well. So you need to take those kind of two perspectives, which actually is a multitude of perspectives. You need to take them on board to build solutions for that work better, that the energy transition, the climate transition can be an opportunity to make sure that we kind of solve certain of the most pressing issues of our planet as well.
So, and I think this is where the citizen-led energy transition and the energy infrastructure owned by citizens, right? Where
Yeah.
it's decentralized and citizens holding that ownership also gives them the right to and the power over how much they pay and how much they want to pay around it. I think, yeah, I think it's like to look at it the way that we're finally closing the loop of where we talked about citizen-led energy transition. So maybe at the final point that I would like to ask, who are the major stakeholders that you see and that you all always generally interact with, right? Who can enable this kind of this transition at the scale of EU? I'm sure there are public as well as private, profit, for-profit, non-profit agencies. So, who are these major stakeholders that you see playing a key role?
I mean, I think that every stakeholder has a role to play, in the sense that stakeholders, whether public or private, they remain like constituted by people, and people at the end of the day are the one that make the decision collectively. They steer. So it's about like the company culture somehow, if you want, or the business culture, or the administration culture. But you can have, and you can work with really huge range of stakeholders. But I think that one, let's say that for me, the one that need to be a little bit more invited to the table are really civil society representative, like whether they are consumer organization representative, whether they are unions, whether they are also, let's say, grassroots initiatives or anti-racist movements of women's rights movements, because everybody is affected by the climate crisis. Everybody will be impacted also kind of differently. So solutions also need to be tailored to the needs of the different organizations. And that's why it's really important to make sure that everybody has a chance to express their view. So the democratic instruments that we have in Europe, like we are really lucky to live in democracies that are actually like respecting, that are real democracy, that are respecting the rights of their citizens, etc. But it's not enough. It's not enough because there are political agendas that may or may not be go as fast as you would like to. So there are plenty of ways to kind of boost those various, let's say, policy initiatives. And another, I think it's also important to really to build partnerships and build bridges between like the public, the private, the non-profit, the grassroots, the regulators, the ombudsmen that are also able to like assess the complaints and aggregate the complaints, etc. Because everybody has a part of the answer. It's such a collective issue. We need collective wisdom, and we need to feed each other with this kind of collective wisdom and collective ideas. Otherwise, the answers will only be partial.
And I believe someone like you in your line of work is the one who definitely connects with all these stakeholders at different levels and tries to bring out this change. And
Yeah, try to.
and I believe maybe that's one of the reasons why you've been recently nominated for the award from the Florence School of Regulation. Really wish you all the best, Marine, for that. And I think we can conclude our episode here. Thank you very much for joining in. Thank you very much for your time and sharing in your ideas.